Easter and the Global Archetype of Spring Renewal, a comparative mythological essay. Easter occupies a unique position in the landscape of world mythology and religious symbolism. While firmly rooted in Christian theology as the celebration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the holiday also resonates with a much older and broader set of cultural patterns. Across civilizations, spring has long been understood as a moment of cosmic renewal. The earth awakens, light returns, vegetation rises from the soil, and life reasserts itself after the dormancy of winter. Easter, in its timing, imagery, and ritual structure, stands at the intersection of these ancient seasonal archetypes and the Christian narrative of death and rebirth. Understanding Easter in this wider mythological context reveals a tapestry of deities, symbols, and stories that echo one another across time and geography. At the center of the Christian tradition is Jesus Christ, whose resurrection forms the theological core of Easter. His rising from the dead is framed not merely as a return to life, but as the inauguration of a new creation, a transformation that mirrors the natural world's shift from winter barrenness to spring vitality. This theme of resurrection, however, is not unique to Christianity. Many ancient cultures articulated similar patterns through their own deities, whose cyclical deaths and returns symbolize the rhythms of nature. Figures such as Osiris in Egypt, Dumuzi/Tammuz in Mesopotamia, Adonis and Dionysus in Greece, and Attis in Phrygia all embody the archetype of the dying and rising god. Their myths dramatize the seasonal cycle, the descent into darkness or the underworld, followed by a triumphant return that restores fertility to the land. These narratives do not diminish the distinctiveness of the Christian story, rather, they highlight a universal human impulse to interpret seasonal renewal through the lens of divine transformation. Another layer of Easter's symbolic heritage emerges from European spring traditions, particularly those associated with dawn, fertility, and the reawakening of the earth. The Anglo-Saxon goddess Easter, or Ostra, though attested only briefly in historical sources, has become emblematic of this dimension. Her associations with the dawn, with blossoming life, and with the hare, a potent symbol of fertility, align closely with the imagery that later became attached to Easter in the English-speaking world. Whether or not Easter was widely worshipped in antiquity, her symbolic resonance is undeniable. She represents the return of light, the lengthening of days, and the promise of new beginnings. Similar motifs appear in the traditions of Persephone and Demeter in Greece, Flora in Rome, Brigid in Celtic lands, and Freyr and Idun in Norse mythology. Each embodies a facet of spring's generative power, reinforcing the idea that Easter participates in a much older seasonal grammar. Easter's dawn services and emphasis on light overcoming darkness also echo global traditions centered on solar and dawn deities. Figures such as Eos and Aurora in the Greco-Roman world, Amaterasu in Japan, and Sol in the Baltic region all dramatize the daily or seasonal return of illumination. Amaterasu's emergence from her cave, for instance, is a mythic moment of cosmic renewal that parallels the symbolic structure of resurrection. Darkness is dispelled, order is restored, and life resumes its rightful course. These parallels do not imply direct borrowing, but rather reflect a shared human intuition about the cyclical nature of time, and the spiritual significance of light's return. Even Easter's most familiar symbols, the egg and the hare, carry deep mythological roots. Eggs appear in creation myths from India to Greece, representing potentiality, birth, and the emergence of life from apparent inertness. Hares, with their rapid reproduction and lunar associations, symbolize fertility and cyclical renewal in Celtic, Germanic, and East Asian traditions. These symbols were not invented by Christianity, but were absorbed into the cultural environment in which Easter developed, enriching the holiday's visual and ritual vocabulary. Finally, Easter's historical proximity to Passover adds another dimension to its meaning. Passover commemorates liberation, covenant renewal, and the beginning of a new life for the Israelites. The Christian narrative of Easter emerges directly from this context, transforming themes of deliverance and rebirth into a universalized spiritual drama. In this sense, Easter stands at the crossroads of Jewish historical memory, Christian theological innovation, and the deep mythic structures of the ancient world. Taken together, these layers reveal Easter as a festival that harmonizes multiple symbolic traditions. It is at once a celebration of Christ's resurrection, a continuation of ancient spring rites, and a reflection of universal human patterns of meaning-making. The holiday's power lies in this synthesis. It speaks to the spiritual, the natural, and the mythological all at once. Easter becomes not merely a date on the liturgical calendar, but a moment when cultures across time converge in their recognition of life's capacity to renew itself. In this way, Easter stands as one of humanity's most enduring expressions of hope, regeneration, and the triumph of life over death. Theological logic supports a 1st century origin. The earliest Christian writings, Paul's letters, already treat the resurrection as the central event of the faith. Paul quotes an even earlier creed in 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3-5, showing that belief in the resurrection was formalized within a few years of Jesus' death. Easter Sunday's origin emerges from several intertwined historical and religious streams, but its core meaning is firmly rooted in early Christianity. At its heart, Easter marks the resurrection of Jesus, an event the New Testament describes as occurring on the third day after his crucifixion. This belief is so central to Christianity that the earliest followers almost certainly commemorated it from the beginning. The first recorded observances appear in the 2nd century, but scholars agree the practice is older, because the resurrection was already the defining claim of the Christian movement. The 4th century historian Eusebius of Caesarea is one of the most important witnesses to early Christian tradition, and his account strongly supports the idea that the Easter date dispute, and therefore Easter observance itself, was already ancient by the time it appears in written history. In his ecclesiastical history, Eusebius preserves letters and testimonies from earlier bishops, including Polycrates of Ephesus and Victor of Rome, who were arguing about the correct date for Easter in the late 2nd century. Crucially, Eusebius reports that the disagreement was not a new controversy but one that had existed from the beginning, meaning from the earliest generations of the Christian movement, indicating that the practice was already considered ancient and apostolic by the 4th century. Eusebius also records Polycrates' claim that major early Christian figures, Philip, John, and others, had themselves observed the 14 Nisan date, and that this tradition had been handed down through multiple generations of bishops in Asia Minor. Because Eusebius is drawing on earlier written correspondence and oral traditions, his testimony shows that the Easter date dispute was not a 2nd century invention but the continuation of a much older divergence. The fact that both sides in the dispute appealed to apostolic authority, and that Eusebius frames the controversy as rooted in the earliest Christian communities, strongly suggests that some form of annual Easter observance existed in the 1st century, within living memory of the apostles themselves. Of balance, themes embodied by Tsongjie and echoed throughout the seasonal cycle. Today, the date of Easter was standardized in 325 CE at the Council of Nicaea, which ruled that it should fall on the first Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox. This tied the celebration to both lunar and solar cycles, echoing the ancient Jewish calendar and ensuring that Easter would always remain a spring festival of renewal. As a result, Easter can fall between March 22 and April 25 in Western Christianity. What makes this controversy historically significant is that both sides claimed apostolic authority for their respective traditions. Polycrates appealed to John and Philip, Victor appealed to Peter and Paul. This mutual appeal to the apostles is a strong indicator that the practice of commemorating Easter was already well established by the 1st century, within living memory of the apostles themselves. No community in the late 2nd century would claim apostolic origins for a practice that was new or recently invented. The intensity of the dispute, the depth of the traditions involved, and the fact that Eusebius later described the disagreement as having existed from the beginning, all point to the same conclusion. The annual celebration of Easter was not a 2nd century innovation but a deeply rooted practice that emerged in the earliest decades of the Christian movement. Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek. The Septuagint, translators and later editors expanded the book to make it more explicitly religious, more emotionally expressive, and more aligned with the theological worldview of diaspora Jews who wanted to see God's hand clearly at work in their sacred narratives. One of the most important historical factors behind the additions was the need to defend Jewish identity in a multicultural empire. Diaspora Jews in Egypt often faced suspicion, accusations of separatism, and pressure to assimilate. The Hebrew Esther already addressed themes of minority survival, but the Greek additions intensified these themes by inserting long royal decrees, editions B and E, that mirrored real Hellenistic administrative documents. These decrees portray the Jews as loyal subjects falsely accused by corrupt officials, an argument that would have resonated strongly with Jews living under Greek rule. By expanding the political and legal dimensions of the story, the editions functioned as a kind of diaspora apologetic, defending Jewish distinctiveness while affirming their loyalty to imperial authority. Another major historical reason for the editions was the religious sensibility of Hellenistic Jews, who expected sacred texts to explicitly acknowledge God's role in human affairs. The Hebrew Esther's silence about God was troubling for many ancient readers. Early Jewish and Christian interpreters frequently commented on this absence. In the Greek editions, this problem is solved by inserting prayers, divine intervention, and prophetic framing. Editions C and D, for example, give Esther and Mordecai long, heartfelt prayers that align the book with other popular Jewish works of the period such as Judith, Tobit, and the Greek Daniel traditions. These editions reflect a theological conviction common in the diaspora: God must be visibly active in the story of Israel, even when the setting is foreign and the threat is political. The editions therefore transform Esther into a narrative of divine providence, making it more suitable for liturgical use and more consistent with the religious expectations of Greek-speaking Jews. Finally, the editions served a liturgical and communal function, especially in relation to the festival of Purim. Purim was widely celebrated in the diaspora, but its origins were not universally understood or accepted. The Hebrew Esther legitimized the festival historically, but the Greek editions strengthened its religious legitimacy by framing the events as part of God's salvific plan. Edition F, which interprets Mordecai's dream, explicitly states that the deliverance of the Jews was foretold and divinely orchestrated. This theological framing helped diaspora communities celebrate Purim not merely as a cultural holiday, but as a religious commemoration of God's intervention. In this way, the editions reinforced communal identity, strengthened the festival's authority, and integrated Esther more fully into the sacred narrative of Israel. 2 ND century disputes imply earlier origins. By around AD 190, the Christian world was divided between two established traditions. The Quartodecimans of Asia Minor, led by Polycrates, who celebrated Easter on 14 Nisan, the date of the Jewish Passover regardless of the weekday. The Roman and Western churches, led by Victor I, who insisted Easter must be celebrated on a Sunday, the day of the resurrection. Polycrates, representing the churches of Asia Minor, defended the ancient practice of celebrating Easter on 14 Nisan, the date of the Jewish Passover, regardless of the day of the week. He argued that this was the tradition handed down directly from major early Christian figures, including John the Apostle, Philip, Polycarp, and other leaders associated with the earliest Christian communities in the region. For Polycrates, the timing of Jesus' death and resurrection during Passover week was not incidental but theologically essential. Because the apostles themselves had observed the festival in connection with Passover, he believed the Church was obligated to preserve this inherited pattern. Victor of Rome, by contrast, insisted that Easter must always be celebrated on a Sunday, the day Christians associated with the resurrection. The Roman and Western churches had long observed Easter on the first Sunday after the Passover full moon, and Victor claimed this practice originated with Peter and Paul, the apostolic founders of the Roman Church. For Victor, Sunday was not merely a convenient day, but the weekly celebration of the resurrection itself. To him, anchoring Easter to Sunday preserved the theological meaning of the event more clearly than tying it to the Jewish calendar. Victor believed the unity of the Church required a uniform date, and he attempted to impose the Sunday observance on all Christian communities. In Jewish tradition, 14 Nisan is the day of preparation for Passover, one of the most important festivals in Judaism. On this day, Jewish households complete the removal of chametz, which is any leavened bread or grain product forbidden during Passover. It is also the day when the fast of the firstborn is traditionally observed, a symbolic remembrance of the biblical story in which the firstborn of Egypt died while the firstborn of Israel were spared in ancient times, before the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE. 14 Nisan was the day when the Passover lamb was slaughtered. Families would bring their lamb to the temple, where it was sacrificed according to the instructions in the book of Exodus. The lamb would then be taken home and roasted for the Passover meal. I did the modern-day version of this. At sunset on 14 Nisan, the day transitions into 15 Nisan, because in the Hebrew calendar a new day begins at sundown. This evening marks the start of Passover itself, including the first Seder, the ritual meal that commemorates the Israelites' liberation from slavery in Egypt. In other words, 14 Nisan is the final day of preparation, and the Seder begins that night as the calendar moves into the next day. So prep work isn't waiting to that day but being proactive the days leading to. This date is also extremely important in early Christian history. Many early Christians believed that Jesus' death and resurrection occurred during Passover week, and some communities, especially in Asia Minor, celebrated Easter on 14 Nisan itself, aligning their observance with the Jewish Passover. These Christians were known as Quartodecimans, from the Latin word for 14th. They argued that this was the practice handed down from the apostles, particularly John, and that the timing of Jesus' death during Passover was theologically significant. This belief became the heart of the famous dispute between Polycrates of Ephesus and Victor of Rome in the late 2nd century, a conflict over whether Easter should be tied to 14 Nisan, or always celebrated on a Sunday. In the centuries that followed, the Roman method eventually became dominant, especially after the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE standardized the Sunday rule for most of the Christian world. Yet the Quartodeciman tradition remains an important window into the earliest Christian attempts to understand the meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection. It reminds us that the Christian calendar did not appear fully formed, but emerged from the complex interplay of Jewish heritage, apostolic memory, and developing Christian identity. Asia Minor was also a center of theological diversity and debate. The Cambridge History of Christianity notes that the region produced a wide range of Christian expressions, including Catholic Orthodox communities, Montanists, the New Prophets, Novatianists, and other groups. Inscriptions from the region show Christians living alongside their pagan neighbors, sometimes blending into civic life and sometimes standing apart. The famous epitaph of Abersius, a Christian bishop from Phrygia in the late 2nd century, describes a network of shared faith stretching from Rome to Syria, illustrating how interconnected the churches of Asia Minor were with the wider Christian world. The Apostle John, exiled on the island of Patmos, received a vision from Christ, who instructed him to write letters to these 7 churches. These letters are found in Revelation chapters 2 and 3 and serve as both commendations and admonitions, offering timeless lessons for the Church universal. The church in Smyrna faced severe persecution and poverty, yet it is described as spiritually rich. Jesus encourages them with the words, "Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer," Revelation 2 verse 10, promising the crown of life to those who remain faithful even unto death. Smyrna is one of the 2 churches that receive no rebuke, highlighting their steadfast faith amidst trials. 3. Pergamum was a center of pagan worship and imperial cults. The church is praised for holding fast to Christ's name despite residing where Satan has his throne, Revelation 2 verse 13. However, they are criticized for tolerating teachings that lead to idolatry and immorality, specifically those of Balaam and the Nicolaitans. The call to repentance is urgent, with a promise of hidden manna and a white stone for the overcomers. 4. Thyatira. Known for its trade guilds and commerce, Thyatira's church is commended for its love, faith, service, and perseverance. Yet, it is rebuked for tolerating that woman Jezebel, who leads believers into immorality and idolatry, Revelation 2 verse 20, equals Pergamum. The message emphasizes the need for discernment and purity, with a promise of authority over nations for those who overcome. 5. Sardis. The church in Sardis has a reputation for being alive but is spiritually dead. The call to wake up and strengthen what remains, Revelation 3 verse 2, is a stark reminder of the need for vigilance and renewal. The few who have not soiled their garments are promised to walk with Christ in white, symbolizing purity and victory. Treating the body and mind well. 6. Philadelphia is commended for its faithfulness despite having little strength. The church is assured of an open door that no one can shut, and is promised protection from the hour of trial. The exhortation to hold fast what you have, Revelation 3 verse 11, underscores the importance of perseverance. Philadelphia, like Smyrna, receives no rebuke, highlighting its steadfastness. 7. Laodicea. The church in Laodicea is known for its wealth and self-sufficiency, but is rebuked for being lukewarm, Revelation 3 verse 16. The call to buy from me gold refined by fire, Revelation 3 verse 18, is an invitation to seek true spiritual riches and healing. The promise of sharing Christ's throne is extended to those who open the door to Him and overcome their complacency. The messages to the 7 churches of Asia Minor serve as a mirror reflecting the spiritual state of churches throughout history. They offer encouragement, correction, and hope, urging believers to remain faithful and vigilant in their walk with Christ. The promise of hidden manna and a white stone in Revelation 2 verse 17. In the book of Revelation, Jesus addresses several early Christian communities in Asia Minor, offering encouragement, correction, and promises to those who remain faithful despite pressure, persecution, or spiritual compromise. One of the most intriguing promises appears in Revelation 2 verse 17, where Jesus tells the believers in Pergamum that to the one who overcomes, He will give hidden manna and a white stone with a new name written on it. These images are symbolic, drawn from both Jewish scripture and the cultural world of the Roman Empire, and they would have carried deep meaning for the original audience. Understanding them requires stepping into the symbolic universe of the first century, where biblical imagery, Jewish tradition, and Greco-Roman customs all intersect. This actual is where you get your real and final or first name. The hidden name, in which you should not give to others, it's for yourself. But who doesn't want to say LOL? He manna is the same as the seethes, or known by other terms such as chi. I have listed in other videos what it meant to have dominion over nature. That would be the Hebrew and Greek and Roman understandings of these same principles. Revelation 2 verse 17. King James Version. 17 He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. To him that overcometh will I give to eat of the hidden manna, and will give him a white stone, and in the stone a new name written, which no man knoweth saving he that receiveth it. The first symbol, hidden manna, reaches back to the story of Israel in the wilderness. In the Old Testament, manna was the miraculous bread that God provided to sustain the Israelites during their 40 years of wandering. It was a sign of God's faithfulness, nourishment, and presence in a time of hardship. According to Jewish tradition, a portion of this manna was placed in a golden jar and stored in the Ark of the Covenant as a testimony to future generations. Some Jewish writings even suggest that this hidden manna would reappear in the end times as a sign of God's renewed covenant. When Revelation speaks of hidden manna, it draws on this rich background. The promise is not about physical food but about spiritual sustenance, the inner strength, wisdom, and divine nourishment that only Christ can give. It is hidden because it is not visible to the world. It is reserved for those who remain faithful, those who overcome the pressures of their environment. In this sense, hidden manna represents Christ Himself as the true bread of life, the one who sustains believers in their spiritual journey. The second symbol, the white stone, is equally layered but comes from a different cultural world. In the Greco-Roman context, white stones were used in several important ways. In ancient courts, jurors cast stones to vote on a defendant's guilt or innocence. A black stone meant condemnation, while a white stone meant acquittal. Thus, a white stone could symbolize forgiveness, justification, and freedom from judgment. White stones also served as tokens of admission to banquets, festivals, or special gatherings. These stones were sometimes inscribed with a person's name and functioned as a kind of ticket or pass. This meaning resonates strongly with Revelation's imagery of the marriage supper of the Lamb, the great banquet of God's kingdom. Finally, in athletic competitions, victors were sometimes awarded a white stone as a symbol of their triumph, granting them honor and privileges. All of these cultural associations, acquittal, admission, victory, would have been familiar to the Christians of Asia Minor. The white stone in Revelation also contains a new name, known only to the one who receives it. In biblical thought, a name is not merely a label but a revelation of identity, character, and destiny. A new name signifies transformation, a new identity given by God, marking the believer as His own. The fact that the name is known only to the recipient suggests intimacy and personal relationship. It is a private affirmation of belonging, a divine acknowledgement that the overcomer has been accepted, vindicated, and granted a place in God's eternal kingdom. In a city like Pergamum, where Christians faced pressure to participate in imperial cult worship, and where loyalty to Christ could bring social or political consequences, this promise of divine approval would have been profoundly reassuring. Taken together, the promises of hidden manna and a white stone form a powerful message to believers who remain faithful in the face of compromise or persecution. The hidden manna assures them that Christ himself will sustain them with spiritual strength that the world cannot see or understand. The white stone assures them of divine acceptance, victory, and a new identity rooted not in the judgments of society but in the approval of God. These symbols speak to both the present and the future. They offer nourishment for the believer's current struggles and a promise of honor and belonging in the life to come. In this way, Revelation 2 verse 17 communicates that those who overcome will receive both inner sustenance and eternal recognition, gifts that reflect the depth of God's commitment to his people. For myself, this has always been my main connection, this and 5 ad and 300 ad area, like a knowing or belief I've always had. And now I'm starting to see why, but I am having a really weird time believing this despite my pre-programming, it would seem. Easter is mentioned by the 8th century monk Bede, who wrote that April, Ostermna, was named after her, and that feasts were held in her honor. The information about the 8th century monk Bede, often called the Venerable Bede, comes from well-established historical sources. Saint Bede the Venerable, born 672/673, died May 25, 735, was an Anglo-Saxon theologian, historian, and chronologist. He is known for his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, ecclesiastical history of the English people, a source vital to the history of the Anglo-Saxon tribes' conversion to Christianity. Interesting to note, when did Saint Bede become a saint? According to the search results, Bede was canonized in 1899 by Pope Leo XIII. This is surprisingly late, more than 1,100 years after his death in 735. Saint Bede's path to sainthood is one of the most unusual in Christian history, because although he lived and died in the 8th century, he was not formally canonized until 1899, more than 11 centuries later. During his lifetime, Bede was a monk at the twin monasteries of Monkwearmouth Jarrow in Northumbria, where he devoted himself to scholarship, biblical commentary, history, and the study of timekeeping. His most famous work, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People, became the foundational text for understanding early English history, and earned him immense respect throughout medieval Europe. For centuries after his death in 735, Bede was honored locally and across Christendom as a holy man and a model of monastic learning. He was widely referred to as the Venerable Bede, a title that signaled deep reverence but did not constitute official canonization. In the early medieval period, sainthood was often recognized informally by local communities or bishops, and Bede's reputation flourished in this organic, decentralized way. It wasn't until the late 19th century that the Roman Catholic Church formally canonized him. In 1899, Pope Leo XIII issued a papal decree officially declaring Bede a saint and simultaneously naming him a doctor of the Church, a rare honor reserved for the most influential theologians and teachers in Christian tradition. This recognition acknowledged not only Bede's personal holiness, but also the extraordinary intellectual legacy he left behind, his historical writings, his biblical scholarship, and his contributions to the calculation of the liturgical calendar. By elevating him to sainthood and granting him the title of doctor, the Church affirmed that Bede's work had shaped Christian thought for more than a millennium, and would continue to do so. His canonization stands as a testament to the enduring power of scholarship, showing that intellectual devotion can be as spiritually significant as martyrdom or miracle working. Saint Bede the Venerable left behind one of the richest bodies of scholarship in early medieval Europe, yet nowhere in his writings does he claim to have experienced visions, apparitions, or encounters with angels. This absence is striking because many medieval saints were remembered for dramatic mystical experiences, but Bede's sanctity took a very different form. His spirituality was rooted in study, contemplation, and the disciplined life of a monk devoted to understanding scripture, history, and the workings of the liturgical year. Although he wrote extensively about angels, exploring their roles as messengers, protectors, and participants in salvation history, he always approached the subject through theology and exegesis rather than personal revelation. Later medieval tradition also preserved no stories of angelic visitations surrounding his life or death. Instead, Bede became revered for the clarity of his mind, the humility of his character, and the intellectual devotion that shaped Christian thought for more than a millennium. His legacy demonstrates that holiness can emerge not from visions or miracles, but from a lifetime of disciplined learning and the quiet pursuit of truth. The only early written reference to Easter comes from the monk Bede, in his work The Reckoning of Time, 725 CE. He states that the Anglo-Saxons named April Ostermna, after a goddess called Easter, and that feasts were once held in her honor. Scholars notice that the name Easter/Ostra resembles words for dawn, east, and shining light across Indo-European languages. The search results show that linguists reconstructed a Proto-Germanic goddess named Ostro, descended from the Proto-Indo-European dawn goddess *H2yus. The idea of Easter, the Germanic goddess of spring, comes from a combination of early medieval writing, linguistic reconstruction, and later archaeological discoveries. The earliest and only direct historical reference to her appears in the 8th century, when the monk Bede wrote that the Anglo-Saxons once celebrated a spring festival in a month named after a goddess called Easter. Although Bede provides no myths or rituals, his brief mention became the foundation for all later interpretations. Linguists later noticed that her name resembles words for dawn, east, and shining light across Indo-European languages, suggesting she may descend from a much older dawn goddess reconstructed as *H2yus. This connection places Easter within a widespread family of deities associated with light, renewal, and the turning of the seasons. Archaeological discoveries in Germany, particularly inscriptions dedicated to the Matrone Austriacini, strengthened the case that Bede was describing a real goddess whose cult had continental parallels. Over time, modern scholars, Neopagan traditions, and popular culture expanded her symbolism, linking her with hares, eggs, and spring rebirth, even though these details do not appear in Bede's original text. As a result, the modern image of Easter is a blend of historical evidence, linguistic insight, and contemporary reconstruction, all rooted in a single line from an early medieval chronicle. How Easter connects to Easter. The connection between Easter and Easter begins with Bede's statement that the Anglo-Saxons once celebrated a spring festival in a month named after her, Ostermna. Once celebrated a spring festival. In a month named after her, Ostermna. When Christianity spread through England, the old festival month name survived and eventually became attached to the Christian celebration of the resurrection. This linguistic inheritance is why English and German use the words Easter and Ostern, while most other European languages use forms of Pascha, derived from Passover. Although Bede never described rituals or symbols associated with Easter, later folklorists and Neopagan traditions linked her with themes of rebirth, fertility, and the returning light of spring, ideas that resonate strongly with the Christian message of resurrection and renewal. Over time, cultural practices such as decorated eggs, spring flowers, and the hare or rabbit became associated with Easter, not because they were directly tied to Easter in ancient sources, but because they fit naturally into the broader symbolic landscape of springtime regeneration. Thus, the connection between Easter and Easter is not one of direct continuity, but of linguistic survival and thematic resonance, a Christian holy day layered over an older seasonal framework that celebrated the return of life after winter. So this name is just one of the 99 names rumored to be known under as for some of the others listed, and clearly I am missing important pieces. They're from before 1 BC, hence the issue, and the simple term aka sun worship. I realized how much I don't know about that event, and its creation in our history, so I did a minor dive, LOL play on words. I'm still wondering what the underlying message is, and this is one interpretation that could be formulated. Others would say I didn't see what I saw, and it must be a hallucination, but this neglects the other videos I took explicitly for these purposes alone. I kind of just want to work it out, and put it out as a backup and track along the way so I can see interpretation differences I may have, or any that may change, or be persuaded by the environment, if so how, why, and reformulate. Now let's get back to it. I'm trying not to leave out any one as the connection seem apparent. P. In Mesopotamian mythology, the goddess most closely associated with spring is Inanna, known in Akkadian as Ishtar, whose myths embody the cycle of death, rebirth, and the renewal of the natural world. Although she is a complex deity with domains spanning love, sexuality, fertility, political power, and war, her role in the seasonal cycle is one of the oldest and most influential in human storytelling. The key myth that links her to spring is Inanna's descent to the underworld, in which she travels to the realm of the dead, is stripped of her powers, and is ultimately killed and hung on a hook. During her absence, the world above becomes barren, crops fail, animals stop reproducing, and the land enters a symbolic winter. When she is revived and allowed to return to the living world, life returns with her, plants sprout, fertility resumes, and the warmth of spring symbolically re-enters the world. This myth is one of the earliest recorded explanations for the seasonal cycle, predating Greek stories like Persephone by more than 1,000 years. Her consort Dumuzi, later called Tammuz, deepens this seasonal symbolism. He represents vegetation and agricultural abundance, and his own cyclical death and return mirror the sprouting and withering of crops. When Dumuzi descends to the underworld, the land dries and dies. When he returns, the earth blooms again. Together, Inanna and Dumuzi form a divine pair whose movements explain the rhythm of the seasons, making Inanna the closest Mesopotamian equivalent to a goddess of spring, even though she held many other roles. Her festivals, celebrated in early spring, emphasized renewal, fertility, and the reawakening of the land, core themes that echo across later cultures and remain recognizable in modern springtime traditions. In ancient Egypt, the closest equivalent to a goddess of spring, youth, and seasonal renewal was Renput, also spelled Renanutut in some contexts, though they are distinct deities. Renput's name literally meant year, and she personified the annual cycle, especially the moment of rebirth and fresh growth that marked the Egyptian New Year. According to the search results, Renput was depicted as a young woman wearing a palm shoot on her head, a hieroglyphic symbol representing time, renewal, and the turning of the seasons. She was known as the Mistress of Eternity, a title that emphasized her connection to the cyclical return of life and the rejuvenation of the land each year. Another source describes her as the goddess who personified fertility, spring, and youth, worshipped especially in Memphis and Crocodilopolis, and sometimes understood as an aspect or expression of Isis's life-giving power. Because the Egyptian calendar was tied to the flooding of the Nile, the event that brought fertility back to the soil, Renput symbolized the moment when the world renews itself, much like spring goddesses in other cultures. Her image appears frequently on monuments and official inscriptions, because the palm shoot glyph was used to mark the regnal year of each pharaoh, making her not only a seasonal goddess but also a guardian of time itself. In this way, Renput served as Egypt's embodiment of springtime vitality, the return of abundance, and the eternal cycle of life, death, and renewal. The Great Cycles of Renewal, festivals that defined ancient Egypt. In North America. Across these cultures, spring is in North America. North America has no single goddess of spring, because indigenous cultures across the continent are incredibly diverse, each with its own cosmology, seasonal stories, and spiritual beings. But many nations share a deep understanding of seasonal renewal, the return of life, and the balance between winter and spring, expressed through stories of earth mothers, plant spirits, and beings who govern growth. These traditions are not framed as gods in the European sense, instead, they describe persons of the natural world, powers, spirits, or relatives who participate in the cycles of life. Among many Eastern woodlands nations, for example, the return of spring is tied to the earth as a living mother, whose body awakens after winter's sleep. The Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, speak of the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, as living beings whose spirits return each year to feed the people, and their agricultural cycle is honored in ceremonies like the Maple Festival, Planting Festival, and Strawberry Festival, each marking a stage of spring's arrival. In the Great Plains, spring is associated with the thunder beings, who bring the rains that awaken the earth, and with the renewal of the buffalo herds that sustained life. In the Pacific Northwest, many nations honor first food ceremonies, celebrating the return of salmon, roots, and berries, each understood as a gift from spiritual relatives who choose to return if treated with respect. Farther south, among Pueblo and Hopi peoples, spring is tied to the Katsanam, Kachinas, spirit messengers who bring rain, fertility, and the renewal of crops. Their return to the villages each year symbolizes the reopening of the world after winter. Across these cultures, spring is not governed by a single deity, but by a network of relationships between humans, animals, plants, ancestors, and the land itself. Renewal is understood as a reciprocal process. The world awakens because humans uphold their responsibilities through ceremony, gratitude, and respectful living. Instead of a goddess like Easter or Inanna, indigenous North American traditions emphasize the living earth, the spirits of plants and animals, and the cyclical return of life as sacred events woven into the fabric of community. This worldview makes spring not just a season but a moment of reconnection, when the land, the people, and the spirit world move together into a new cycle of growth. Across ancient Southeast Asia, including regions that are now Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Indonesia, and the Philippines, seasonal renewal was governed not by a single spring goddess but by a network of deities tied to rain, fertility, agriculture, and the rebirth of the land, reflecting the tropical climate where planting seasons mattered more than spring itself. In ancient Thailand and Cambodia, the goddess Phra-Mathorani, the Earth Mother, played a central role in renewal. She was invoked at the start of agricultural cycles and appears in early Buddhist mythology as the force that restores purity and life to the world. In mainland Southeast Asia, the most important seasonal festival was Songkran, the traditional New Year celebrated in mid-April, which marked the beginning of the rainy season and symbolized cleansing, rebirth, and the renewal of life, a functional equivalent to spring festivals elsewhere. In Indonesia and the Malay world, fertility and renewal were associated with Dewi Sri, the ancient rice goddess whose myths describe the death and rebirth of vegetation. She was honored during planting and harvest rituals that marked the cycle of life returning to the fields. Among the ancient peoples of the Philippines, deities such as Idianali, labor and productivity, Lakapati, fertility and agriculture, and Bathala's nature spirits governed the renewal of crops and the return of abundance, with rituals timed to the monsoon cycle rather than a spring season. Across these cultures, the symbolic meaning of spring, rebirth, growth, and the return of life, was expressed through rain gods, rice goddesses, earth mothers, and New Year festivals, making Southeast Asia an essential part of the global tapestry of seasonal renewal traditions. In the cultural and religious traditions of India, the arrival of spring is closely associated with the goddess Sarasvati, who embodies knowledge, music, learning, and the awakening of the human spirit. Although Sarasvati is not a fertility goddess in the conventional sense, She is honored as the divine force that brings clarity, renewal, and creative energy at the turning of the season. Her connection to spring is expressed most clearly through the festival of the Sant Panchami, a major celebration that marks the formal beginning of the spring cycle. Observed on the 5th day of the bright half of the month of Magha, the Sant Panchami is dedicated to Saraswati and is celebrated across India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and parts of Southeast Asia. On this day, devotees wear yellow garments, offer yellow flowers, and prepare foods that reflect the color of mustard blossoms, symbolizing the warmth and vitality of the season. Schools, musicians, and artists place their books, instruments, and tools before the goddess to receive her blessings for a new cycle of learning and creativity, and young children often participate in Aksharabhyasam, the ritual of writing their first letters. Through this festival, Saraswati becomes not only the guardian of knowledge but also the spiritual herald of spring, representing the renewal of both nature and the human mind. In this way, India's springtime traditions center on a goddess who brings intellectual blossoming and creative rebirth, making Saraswati the cultural and symbolic embodiment of the season's arrival. In Norse mythology, Idun stands as the central goddess of renewal, springtime vitality, and the cyclical restoration of life. She is the keeper of the golden apples of youth, the sacred fruit that prevents the gods from aging and ensures the continual renewal of their strength. Her mythic abduction by the giant Jotsi, which causes the gods to wither and grow old, symbolizes the harsh stagnation of winter, while her dramatic return represents the rebirth of spring and the restoration of cosmic order. Idun's very name is linked to meanings such as again, to renew, or to rejuvenate, underscoring her role as the embodiment of life's return after dormancy. Although the surviving Norse sources do not describe formal historical festivals dedicated to her, her symbolism permeates the seasonal rhythms of the Viking worldview, making her one of the clearest mythological expressions of spring and renewal in the Norse pantheon. Although no surviving Norse text describes a festival dedicated solely to Idun, her role as the goddess of renewal and spring places her at the symbolic center of several seasonal rites in both historical and modern practice. In the Viking Age, the closest historical observance connected to her themes was Disseblot, a winter-ending ritual honoring female divine powers and ancestral spirits. Because Idun embodies rejuvenation and the return of vitality, many scholars and modern practitioners view her as naturally aligned with this transition from winter's stagnation to spring's awakening. In contemporary Asatru and Heat Henry, Idun is explicitly honored during Varblet, the reconstructed spring blot that celebrates the earth's reawakening, the lengthening of days, and the renewal of life, precisely the forces she governs through her golden apples of youth. She is also invoked during Ostra or Easter celebrations, a Germanic spring festival adopted into modern Norse practice, where she stands alongside other spring goddesses as a symbol of blossoming, fertility, and the restoration of strength. Many practitioners additionally honor Idun at the spring equinox, viewing her return as a mythic parallel to the sun's growing power and the world's shift toward warmth and growth. Even Høstblot, the autumn blot, carries a symbolic connection. While not a spring festival, it often includes offerings or imagery related to Idun's apples as a reminder of continuity, preservation, and the promise that life will return after winter. Together, these festivals form a seasonal cycle in which Idun's presence marks the turning points of renewal, youth, and the eternal return of spring. In Chinese tradition, the role of a spring deity is not held by a single goddess, but by a seasonal figure known as Cangjie, who is identified in some sources as the deity of spring and symbolizes the renewal, awakening, and creative energy that accompany the season's arrival. Unlike the European or Indian pattern of female spring goddesses, Chinese cosmology organizes the seasons through the balance of yin and yang, the 5 elements, and the cyclical movement of qi, which is why the spring deity appears in male form. Cangjie's mythic act of inventing Chinese writing mirrors the essence of spring itself, the beginning of new cycles, the flourishing of culture, and the reopening of the world after winter's stillness. Although there is no single festival dedicated exclusively to him, China's major spring festivals reflect his domain. The most important is the Spring Festival, Chuanjie, known globally as Lunar New Year, which celebrates renewal, the return of life, and the beginning of the agricultural cycle. Soon after comes Lichuan, the beginning of spring, in the traditional solar calendar, marked by rituals welcoming the season's energy. Another key observance is Qingming, the tomb sweeping festival, which occurs in early April and honors ancestors while also marking the time when the earth becomes fertile again, and agricultural work resumes. Together, these festivals express the Chinese understanding of spring as a time of rebirth, harmony, and the restoration of balance, themes embodied by Cangjie and echoed throughout the seasonal cycle. Japan, Konohanasakuya-hime, the blossoming princess. In ancient Japan, the clearest embodiment of spring is the Shinto goddess Konohanasakuya-hime, whose name means princess of the blossoming trees. She is associated especially with sakura, cherry blossoms, which symbolize the arrival of spring, the fragility of life, and the renewal of nature. As the daughter of the mountain god Oyamatsumi, and the wife of the divine ancestor Ninigi no Mikoto, she represents both natural beauty and the generative power of the land. Her mythic role is tied to fertility, childbirth, and the flourishing of plant life, making her one of the most direct spring goddesses outside the Indo-European world. The Japanese tradition of Hanami, the cherry blossom viewing festival, is rooted in ancient rites honoring her. Although Hanami is now secular, its origins lie in Shinto offerings made beneath blooming trees to welcome the agricultural year and pray for a successful planting season. This festival occurs in late March to early April, depending on regional bloom times, and marks the symbolic opening of spring in Japan. Korea, Jachongbi and the agricultural renewal cycle. Ancient Korean mythology, shaped by shamanic traditions, centers springtime renewal around Jachongbi, a goddess of agriculture, grain, and the fertility of the land. Her myths describe her as a bringer of abundance, a restorer of balance, and a divine figure who ensures that crops sprout and flourish. She is not a spring goddess in the narrow sense, but she governs the seasonal rebirth of the earth, fulfilling the same symbolic role. Korean seasonal rites were performed through gut, shamanic ceremonies, and gosa, household offerings, many of which occurred in early spring to ensure a fertile year. The Deborium festival, celebrated on the first full moon of the lunar year, usually February, includes rituals for agricultural luck, protection of the fields, and the renewal of communal bonds. These ceremonies reflect the Korean understanding of spring as a time when the land awakens and human communities must realign themselves with the rhythms of nature. The Andes, Inca and pre-Inca civilizations, Pachamama, and the renewal of the earth. In the Andean world, the concept of spring was replaced by the agricultural cycle, governed by the interplay of rainy and dry seasons. The central figure of renewal was Pachamama, the Earth Mother, who embodied fertility, soil, mountains, and the generative power of the natural world. She was honored throughout the year, but especially at the beginning of the planting season, when offerings were made to ensure that the earth would accept seeds and return abundance. Another important figure was Mama Killa, the moon goddess, whose cycles regulated planting, women's fertility, and the timing of agricultural work. The Inca New Year, Inti Raymi, celebrated at the June solstice, marked the symbolic renewal of the sun and the beginning of preparations for the agricultural year. Although not a spring festival in the European sense, it served the same function: the return of life and the re-energizing of the world. In the southern Andes, the Pachamama Raymi festival, held in August, honored the Earth Mother at the moment when the soil was believed to open again after winter, allowing planting to begin. This was the Andean equivalent of a spring festival, a celebration of the Earth's renewed fertility. Polynesia and Oceania, Earth Mothers and the cycles of life. Across Polynesia and the wider Pacific, seasonal renewal was governed by Earth goddesses, moon deities, and creator spirits whose powers shaped the cycles of growth, fertility, and the return of abundance. In Hawaiian tradition, Haumea is the goddess of fertility, childbirth, and the generative power of the land. She represents the earth's ability to renew itself and bring forth life. Her myths emphasize transformation, regeneration, and the continuity of the natural world. Another major figure is Hina, a moon goddess whose cycles govern tides, fishing seasons, and the rhythms of life. In many Polynesian cultures, the moon, not the sun, determines the agricultural calendar, making Hina a central figure in the renewal of the land. In the broader Austronesian world, especially Indonesia and Malaysia, the rice goddess Dewi Sri embodies fertility, vegetation, and the life force of the fields. Her myths describe her death and rebirth as the origin of rice, making her the symbolic heart of the agricultural cycle. Festivals dedicated to her occur during planting and harvest seasons, particularly in January-March, aligning with the tropical equivalent of spring. Siberia and Central Asia, ice spirits and the return of life after winter. In the far north, where winters are long and severe, the return of warmth and life was celebrated with extraordinary reverence. Among the Yakut, Sakha, people of Siberia, the Ai are benevolent sky spirits who bring fertility, light, and renewal. The most important of these is Ihit, a goddess of birth, creation, and the return of life to the land. She presides over the thawing of the earth, the return of animals, and the beginning of the pastoral cycle. The central festival of renewal is Yakyak, celebrated in June, marking the beginning of summer and the symbolic rebirth of the world. During Yakyak, offerings of fermented mare's milk, kumis, dances, and rituals honor the sky spirits and celebrate the return of warmth, fertility, and abundance. Although this festival occurs later than spring in temperate climates, it fulfills the same symbolic function, the awakening of the world after winter's death. In ancient Mexico, particularly among the Aztec and Maya civilizations, the forces of spring were not embodied by a single goddess but by several deities whose powers governed flowers, fertility, rain, and the renewal of the earth. The Aztec goddess Xochiquetzal, whose name means precious flower, is the closest equivalent to a spring goddess. She presided over blooming plants, youth, beauty, and creative renewal, and was honored during the festival Xochiquetzal, the Feast of Flowers, celebrated in the early part of the solar year when blossoms returned and the warm season began. Another major figure tied to springtime rebirth was Calcayatlicue, goddess of lakes, rivers, and flowing water, whose life-giving waters opened the agricultural cycle. She was honored during Atlicahualo, the first month of the Aztec year, roughly February, when rituals were performed to ensure rain, fertility, and healthy crops. The god Xipe Totec, associated with agricultural renewal and the symbolic shedding of the earth's old skin, was celebrated in Tlaquaxapolisli, the second month of the Aztec calendar, approximately March, marking the beginning of the planting season and the sprouting of new vegetation. Among the Maya, spring renewal was expressed through deities such as Ixchel, fertility and childbirth, Chaka, rain, and Yumcox, maize and new growth, whose ceremonies aligned with the onset of rains and the preparation of fields for planting. Together, these deities and their festivals formed a seasonal cycle in which spring was understood as a sacred moment of rebirth, agricultural renewal, and the return of life to the land across ancient Mesoamerica. So my conclusion is not far from my original analysis. It mainly seems to point in that direction, that they're all one being under different names. The others are real, the realms are real. The stories of the gods are real and humans are both spirit and water, and that is what's needed to be adaptive, so that some reassurance, also noted in the texts, were created of mud and dust. The same mud they were created from, another sign of reassurance from my perspective. The point, it seems, of the historical texts and myths are not just they're so amazing and humans love drama, passion, and a good fight, all of which are typically found in these encounters which later turn to myth, and some seem to be just myth clearly formed of experience, but never recorded, but the belief systems alone all point to similarities throughout the globe. This seems to be true now. This may sound like I'm saying this is the definitive outcome or correct perspective for understanding, but it is still in development. I highlighted some spots in the outline. Those are the ones I feel most connected to and feel to be true, or always knew but had never read from the books prior to, which happens often even with names in the books. It's pretty odd, but one could just say he must have heard them before, so it was already within the subconscious. I would respond we're likely both correct. Play on words. I outlined how the contact experience could be classified within historical text and myths in the past. Bryce or encounter is the person's spiritual initiations from their your own hero story, which could take a day or a lifetime. Then from there you still likely won't find the final answer, but I would say the reassurance within the fact those realms are real is still a pretty good start. As I stated, this is my own personal beliefs and what I researched or found. When I first researched Esther, I did so looking for an alignment. I did so not because Bledsoe said so, haha, I did it because I felt there might be something with that. But I'm lacking the gear and skills to calculate that equation. But considering the history provided within English research and I did it because I felt there might be something with that. but I'm lacking the gear and skills to calculate that equation. I also stated I might be missing some pieces, but considering the history provided within English research and accessibility, this is my current limitations. What I also deduce from all of this based on Easter is to accumulate all religions and understand them under our own terms for myself, and what I have found in relation Eve stated it seems it's God's original plan, and allotted lands deals which leads to the proper form of top-down leadership ruled by God, and not by self-made armies. For the record, I like all fighters. So am not hating. Just saying my interpretation. I can safely say the fact we find the Church has introduced and rewrote this date by associated it with Jesus is still perfectly aligned. All they're doing is going with Abrahamic law, but the only discomfort is they denied the fact of the divine female openly, but rather in the Middle Ages the cult of Mary occurred, but there was also rumors of a renovated Mary there in the 1600s. With that the divine female became associated again. Within the Church there were also encounter one with strictly close resemblance in Ingo Swan's book. Now there was no reference not, but I can 100% say I agree with description of the ending doors. I say that loses so you still can have some fun with the book if you read it. The title But I can 100% say I agree with description of the ending doors. I say that loses so you still can have some fun with the book if you read it. The title is The Great Apparitions of Mary. The page that That's so you still can have some fun with the book if you read it. The title is The Great Apparitions of Mary. The page that hit home with myself was the encounter dated November 27, 1830. The page number is 30. I've stated this also years ago, I'm just recapping and aligning for all. Further to this I would say the female entity could be exactly as all creation myths suggest. They do share almost exactly the same themes, and a lot of the same attributes, so from there we can deduce the common message or basic understanding, mainly shared through experiences which was recorded historically. Now if we wanted to state this from Catholic, Egyptian or Muslim or any other nation, we would be likely naming the same beings by different names, with minor exceptions being the members of the 12 tribes and the rumored one outcast one. Not meaning the tribe of Dan, in which is not written in the Book of Life, with also no mention of them in the Book of Death. Leaving further questions and fears considering the banner. Again, that's my own perspective on things. I'm leaving out a lot of history, for when they change control mechanisms. For example, the Church mentions this same deity in Proverbs under the names Get Wisdom and Understanding and refers to her as female. Then you have other verses I have also highlighted I interrupted to be associated with this principles and beliefs. The spring equinox has also become a natural point of veneration for Iden in contemporary practice. As the balance of light overtakes darkness, her mythic return resonates with the cosmic shift toward warmth, growth, and renewal. Even Hostblot, the autumn blot, carries a symbolic connection to Iden. While not a spring festival, it often includes offerings or imagery related to her apples as reminders of continuity, preservation, and the assurance that life will return after winter's decline. Through these seasonal observances, both historical and reconstructed, Iden emerges as a powerful emblem of the Norse understanding of cyclical time, embodying the eternal return of vitality that sustains both gods and humans. I'm currently just going to continue and track log and revise. As I already said, I've already done this. This is maybe the 4th revision so far, with thoughts assisted and translated with the help of AI, and also allowing anyone to track these myths, legends, truths, and theories. So we have more questions still than answers even after all of this. Such as how many tribes, how does this association work from their understating, or was this humanity's way of interpreting these encounters and events in those days? If so, what is the significance other than the facts mentioned in historical text and experiences, beliefs? What separates some from others? Is it the therianthropes and beings that manifest in this realm? Does this allude to one's tribe or origin? Is the being accompanying her or the entity seen yourself, or a version of what you may achieve in the current state? If so, how does that work in the realms? Is this all just a reminder the realms are real, and there is an order they wish to be followed in our worldly structure? Is any of these even remotely possible? Does that mean that we're basically waiting for a certain tribe member to rejoin their tribe? It does mention explicitly even under spiritual attack failure is forgiven if the work is put in so. I'm unsure, but these ideas don't seem to be new or just my own, but rather found in many experiencers and experiences. Now lastly, a portion bonus round I found while working on this. Name is Sharsha. Now lastly, a bonus round I found while working on this. Name is Sharshathakatha. Amen, 0 Amen, 0 God, 0 God, 0 Amen. I adore thy name, grant thou to me that I may understand thee, grant thou that I may have peace in the Tuat, underworld, and that I may possess all my members therein. And the divine soul which is in Nut Seth, I will make my divine strength to protect thee, and I will perform everything which thou hast said. This interesting text was ordered to be recited over a figure of the God of the lifted hand, i.e., of Amen in his character of the God of generation and reproduction, painted blue, and the knowledge of it was to be kept from the god Sakati in the Tuat. If the directions given in the rubric were properly carried out, it would enable the deceased to drink water in the underworld from the deepest and purest part of the celestial stream, above. Nethet Q, 5, or Nephthys. Nethet, or Nephthys, was the daughter of Seb and Nut, and the sister of Osiris and Isis and Set, and the wife of Set, and the mother of Anpu or Anubis, either by Osiris or Set. The name Nethet means the lady of the house, but by the word house we must understand that portion of the sky which was supposed to form the abode of the sun god Horus. In fact, Het in the name of Nethet is used in exactly the same sense as Het in the name Hethert or Hathor, i.e., the house of Horus. In the earliest times, Nephthys was regarded as the female counterpart of Set, and she was always associated with him. Nevertheless, 1 Diccionario, pi. 378. Goddess Nebthet, Nephthys. The Nephthys 255, as she always appears as the faithful sister and friend of Isis, and helps the widowed goddess to collect the scattered limbs of Osiris and to reconstitute his body. In the pyramid texts she appears as friend of the deceased, and she maintains that character throughout every recension of the bow of the bead. Indeed, she seems to perform for him what as a nature goddess she did for the gods in primeval times when she fashioned the body of the company of the gods, and when she obtained name Nebkat, or happy face, lady of the body of the gods. The goddess is represented in the form of a woman, who wears upon her head a pair of horns and a disc, which is surmounted by the symbol of her name, TT, or the symbol TT only, and her commonest titles are, Dweller within Senu, Lady of Heaven, Mistress of the Gods, Great Goddess, Lady of Life, Sister of the God, Eye of Ra, Lady of Heaven, Mistress of the Gods, Lady of Heaven, Mistress of the Two Lands, Sister of the God, the Creative Goddess who liveth within, etc. The chief centers of her worship Q copyright, Hebit, Liat Bibit, Permert, I33 I were Senarinafert, 3 cubed T equals copyright, Het Sikkim, Het Kaz, Take and Diospolites. In the vignettes of the Theban recension of the Bull of the Bead, we find Nephthys playing a prominent part in connection with Isis, whose efforts it seems to be her duty to second and to forward. She stands in the shrine behind Osiris when the hearts of the dead are weighed in the great scales in the presence of the god. She is seen kneeling on F by the side of the Tet, from which the disk of the sun is thrust upwards by the living Ra, H at sunrise. She is one of the great sovereign chiefs in Tetu with Osiris, Isis, and her Raef, and she kneels at the head of the bier of Osiris and assists him to arise. In the address which she makes, chap. ch.a, she says, I go round about behind Osiris. I have come that I may protect thee, and my strength, which protecteth, shall be behind thee for ever and ever. The god Ra hearkeneth unto thy cry, thou, Zero son of Hathor, art made to 1 Caeg. Zeitschrift, 1864 p.
65.
256 Nephthys, triumph thy head shall never be taken away from thee, and thou shalt be made to rise up in peace. Like Isis, Nephthys was believed to possess magical powers, and Erdhakau, happy face IU, happy face DL, happy face S happy face Y happy face degree words of power, was as much a title of the goddess as of her husband, Setnubdi, the great one of twofold strength, equals F __. Nephthys also, like Isis, has many forms, for she is one of the 2 Mot goddesses, and she is one of the 2 Mert goddesses, and she is one of the 2 plumes which ornamented the head of her father Ra. In her birthplace in Upper Egypt, i.e., Het Sikkim, or the House of the Sistrum, the goddess was identified with Hathor, the Lady of the Sistrum, but the popular name of the city, Het, i.e., the house, seems to apply to both goddesses. In the Serapeum which belonged to the city, or the house of the Bennu, Osiris was Rebam under the form of Horus, and Nephthys was one of his nursing mothers. House of the Bennu. Form of Horus, and Nephthys was one of his nursing mothers. The form in which Osiris appeared here was the moon, and as such he represented the left eye of the Bennu or Ra, and as he thus became closely associated with Khonsu and Thoth, to his female counterparts were ascribed the attributes of Seshida and Mot, who were the female counterparts of Thoth. Nephthys, as the active creative power which protected Osiris, the 3 Tilim happy face moon god, was called Menkhet, and in allusion to her beneficent acts in connection with him the names of Benrameret and Kersket were bestowed upon her, and the former appears to belong to the goddess when she made herself manifest under the form of a cat. From Plutarch's treatise on Isis and Osiris, we may gather many curious facts about the Egyptian beliefs concerning Nephthys. Thus he tells us, section 38, that the Egyptians call the extreme limits of their country, their confines and seashores, Nephthys, and sometimes Telyut, a name expressly signifying the end of anything, whom they suppose likewise to be married to Typho. Now as the overflowings of the Nile are sometimes very great, and extend even to the remotest boundaries of the land, this gave occasion to that part of the story, which regards one Nephthys was born on the last of the 5 epigomenal days. Nephthys 257, the secret commerce between Osiris and Nephthys, and as the natural consequence of so great an inundation would be perceived by the springing up of plants in those parts of the country, which were formerly barren, hence they supposed that Typho was first made acquainted with the injury which had been done his bed by means of a melilot garland which fell from the head of Osiris during his commerce with his wife, and afterwards left behind him. And thus, they say, may the legitimacy of Horus the son of Isis be accounted for, as likewise the spuriousness of Anubis, who was born of Nephthys. So again, when they tell us that it appears from the tables of the successions of their ancient kings, that Nephthys was married to Typho, and that she was at first barren, if this indeed is to be understood, not as spoken of a mortal woman, but of a goddess, then is their design to insinuate the utter infertility of the extreme parts of their land, occasioned by the hardness of the soil and its solidity. Plutarch tells us, moreover, that on the upper part of the convex surface of the sistrum is carved the effigies of a cat with a human visage, as on the lower edge of it, under those moving chords, is engraved on the one side the face of Isis, and on the other that of Nephthys. The face of Isis represents generation, and that of Nephthys corruption, and Plutarch says, section 63, that the cat denotes the moon, its variety of colors, its activity in the night, and the peculiar circumstances which attend its fecundity making a proper emblem of that body. For it is reported of it this creature, that it at first brings forth 1, then 2, afterward 3, and so goes on adding 1 to each former birth till it comes to 7, so that she brings forth 28 in all, corresponding as it were to the several degrees of light, which appear during one of the moon's revolutions. But though this perhaps may appear to carry the air of fiction with it, yet may it be depended upon that the pupils of her eyes seem to fill up and to grow larger upon the full of the moon, and to decrease again and diminish in their brightness upon its waning. As to the human countenance with which this cat is carved, this is designed to denote that the changes of the moon are regulated by understanding and wisdom. 2. 258 Nephthys. From the above paragraphs it is clear that Nephthys is the personification of darkness, and of all that belongs to it, and that her attributes were rather of a passive than active character. She was the opposite of Isis in every respect. Isis symbolized birth, growth, development and vigor, but Nephthys was the type of death, decay, diminution and immobility. Isis and Nephthys were, however, associated inseparably with each other, even as were Horus and Set, and in all the important matters which concern the welfare of the deceased they acted together, and they appear together in bas-reliefs and vignettes. Isis, according to Plutarch, section 44, represented the part of the world which is visible, whilst Nephthys represents that which is invisible, and we may even regard Isis as the day and Nephthys as the night. Isis and Nephthys represent respectively the things which are and the things which are yet to come into being, the beginning and the end, birth and death, and life and death. We have, unfortunately, no means of knowing what the primitive conception of the attributes of Nephthys was, but it is most improbable that it included any of the views on the subject which were current in Plutarch's time. Nephthys is not a goddess with well-defined characteristics, but she may, generally speaking, be described as the goddess of the death which is not eternal. In the Book of the Dead, chapter 17. 30, the deceased is made to say, I am the god Amsu, or Min, in his coming forth, may his 2 plumes be set upon my head for me. In answer to the question, who then is this, the text goes on to say, Amsu is Horus, the avenger of his father, and his coming forth is his birth. The plumes upon his head are Isis and Nephthys when they go forth to set themselves there, even as his protectors, and they provide that which his head lacketh, or, as others say, they are the 2 exceeding great uraei which are upon the head of their father Turn, or as others say, his 2 eyes are the 2 plumes which are upon his head. This passage proves that Nephthys, although a goddess of death, was associated with the coming into existence of the life which springs from death, and that she was, like Isis, a female counterpart of Amsu, the Ithyphallic god, who was at once the type Eoligian p. 735. Nephthys and Isis 259 of virility, and reproduction, and regeneration. Isis and Nephthys prepared the funeral bed for their brother Osiris, and together they made the swathings wherewith his body was swathed after death. They assisted at the rising of the sun god when he rose upon this earth for the first time, they assisted at the resurrection of Osiris, and similarly, in all ages, they together aided the deceased to rise to the new life by means of the words which they chanted over his bier. In late dynastic times there grew up a class of literature which is now represented by such works as the Book of Respirations, the Lamentations of Isis and Nephthys, the Festival Songs of Isis and Nephthys, the Litanies of Seker, etc., works which supply us with the very words which were addressed to Osiris and to all those who were his followers. The goddesses were personified by 2 priestesses who were virgins and who aver ceremonially pure. The hair of their limbs was to be shaved off, they aver to wear ram's wool garlands upon their heads, and to hold tambourines in their hands. On the arm of one of them was to be a fillet inscribed to Isis, and on the arm of the other was to be a fayouet inscribed to Nephthys. On 5 days during the month of December these women took their places in the temple of Abydos and, assisted by the Kerheb, or Prekenter, they sang a series of groups of verses to the god, of which the following are specimens. Hail, Lord Osiris! Hail, Lord Osiris! Hail, Lord Osiris! Hail, Lord Osiris! Hail, beautiful boy, come to thy temple straight way, for we see thee not. Hail, beautiful boy, come to thy temple, and draw nigh after thy departure from us. Hail, beautiful boy, who leadest along the hour, who increasest except at his season. Thou art the exalted image of thy father Tenon, thou art the hidden essence who comest forth from Zitmu. 0 Thou Lord, 0 Thou Lord, how much greater art thou than thy father, 0 Thou eldest son of thy mother's womb. Come thou back again to us with that which belongeth unto thee, and we will embrace thee, depart not thou from us. 0 Thou beautiful and greatly loved face, thou image of Tenon, thou virile one, thou Lord of love. Come thou in peace, and let us see thee. 0 Our Lord, and the two sisters will join thy limbs together, and 260 Nephthys and Isis thou shalt feel no pain, and they shall put an end unto all that hath afflicted thee, even as if it had never been prince, who comest forth from the womb. Hail, hail, eldest son of primeval matter. Forms. Hail, Lord of multitudes of aspects and created. Hail, circle of gold in the temples, and bestower of years. Hail, Lord of time. Hail, Lord of life for all eternity. Lord of millions and myriads. Hail, hail, thou who shinest both in rising and setting. Case. Hail, thou who makest throats to be in good. Hail, thou Lord of terror, thou mighty one of trembling. Hail, Lord of multitudes of aspects, both male and female. Hail, thou who art crowned with the white crown, thou Lord of the Ura crown. Hail, thou holy babe of Haruhikenu. Hail, thou son of Ra, Avho sittest in the boat of millions of years. Hail, thou guide of rest, come thou to thy hidden places, thou Lord of fear, who art self-produced. Hail, hail, thou whose heart is still, come to thy city, of joy, come to thy city. Hail, thou who causest cries. Hail, thou beloved one of the gods and goddesses, thy temple. Hail, thou who dippest thyself in new, come to. Hail, thou who art in the tuat, come thou to thy offerings. Hail, thou holy flower of the great house. Hail, thou who bringest the holy cordage of the Sekti boat. Hail, thou Lord of the Henu boat, who renewest thy youth in this secret place. Hail, thou perfect soul in Netterkurt, thou holy judge of the south and of the north. Hail, hail, thou hidden one, who art known to mankind, shine upon him that is in. Hail, thou who dost the tuat and dost show disk. Him the hail, Lord of the Atef crown, thou mighty one in Sutan, Henan. Hail, mighty one of terror. Hail, thou who risest in Thebes, who dost flourish forever. Hail, thou living soul of Osiris, who art diademed with the moon. Hail, thou who hidest thy body in the great coffin at Heliopolis. And what else I found from Internet Archive books. The serpent was an avenue for evolving complex thought and symbolic experimentation, and through the serpent's perpetual importance throughout the world into the modern era, the slithering anomaly has very well the immortality it has always been known to have. Of the serpent and snake, many varieties were worshipped by the Egyptians for the sake of the good qualities which they possessed, and many were revered through fear only. In pre-dynastic times, Egypt was overrun with serpents and snakes of all kinds, and the pyramid texts prove that her inhabitants were terribly afraid of them. The formulae which are found in the Pyramid of Unas against snakes are probably older than dynastic times, and their large numbers suggest that the serpent tribes were man's chief enemies. The cult of the Uraeus, or ASP, is extremely ancient, and its center was the city of Puruyut, or Buto, where a temple was built in honor of in early dynastic times. The Uraeus goddess Uchit, this city enjoyed with that Nekhbet a position of peculiar importance among the Egyptians, and one of the oldest royal titles is Lord of Nekhbet, Lord of Uchit, i.e., Lord of the Vulture City, Lord of the Uraeus to city. The cities of Nekhbet and Uchit were in fact the ecclesiastical centers of the southern and northern kingdoms of Rawlinson's Herodotus, Volume 2, pages
124, 125.
Goddess Circuit. They were first founded in primitive times when the vulture and the Uraeus were especially worshipped. The great enemy of Horus and Ra and Osiris, and also of the deceased in the underworld, was the monster serpent Apep, or Apophis, which directed the attacks on gods and men of numbers of serpent broods, and which was held to be the personification of all evil. On the other hand, the Uraeus was the symbol of divinity and royalty, for the walls of the abode of Osiris were surmounted by living uraei, and the god Ra wore 2 uraei upon his forehead, and every king is represented with a Uraeus upon his forehead. In primitive times, when men coveted the powers of various birds and reptiles, and when he appears to have wished to be able to assume their forms after death, the priests provided a number of formulae which would enable him to do this, and among them was one which gave the deceased the power of becoming the serpent Sata, and which read, "I am the serpent Sata whose years are many. I die and I am born again each day. I am the serpent Sata which dwelleth in the uttermost parts of the earth. I die and I am born again, and I renew myself, and I grow young each day. In religious texts the uraeus is associated with Isis and Nephthys, but this is due to the fact that in comparatively late times these goddesses were identified with Uchit, the uraeus goddess, who was one time or another absorbed into all the great goddesses, many of whom were regarded as benevolent and beneficent deities and the Prat. This was always one of my internal